In the mid-1970s, a walk through the streets of Miami revealed a scene few Americans could explain. The city's most exclusive stores were filled not with local elites, but with visitors from Venezuela. They arrived in large, energetic groups, loud, joyful, and astonishingly wealthy, moving through shopping malls with confidence and ease. Florida merchants gave them a nickname, the Dameos, meaning simply "give me two." When they liked Italian shoes, they bought 2 pairs. When they bought a colored television, they bought another for the bathroom. They paid in cash, carrying suitcases packed with the crisp American dollars fresh from Caracas. They purchased condos in Brickell and mansions in Coral Gables without asking the price, tipping waiters with $100 bills. To Americans enduring recession and inflation during the Carter years, these visitors felt almost unreal. Back in Caracas, the transformation was even more dramatic. Construction cranes filled the skyline as the city expanded at a pace unmatched anywhere else in the hemisphere. Caracas became the only South American city regularly visited by the Concorde, the supersonic aircraft of the global elite. One could leave Paris and arrive in time for a champagne lunch in Altamira. In Sabana Grande, shops sold the latest fashions from Milan and Paris before they appeared in New York or London. Whiskey flowed freely, with aged scotch consumed as casually as water. It felt like a celebration without an end, an age of limitless wealth later remembered as Saudi Venezuela. The country appeared to have discovered a secret formula for prosperity. To the outside world, Venezuela looked like a miracle. A stable democracy, immense wealth, and peaceful transfers of power every 5 years. Yet, beneath the abundance, it was an illusion waiting to be tested. Venezuela possessed a rapidly expanding middle class, people who owned cars, houses, and modern comforts. Above all, it possessed oil, rivers of oil, oceans of oil that seemed without end. What looked like a miracle was, in reality, a trap. It was a golden cage, built slowly by the global financial system, while those inside were too intoxicated by cheap gasoline and expensive scotch to notice the door closing. The Saudi era did not begin in Caracas, but far away in the deserts of the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted and reshaped the global economy. In response to Western support for Israel, Arab oil-producing nations announced an embargo. Oil prices did not rise gradually. They exploded, quadrupling almost overnight from $3 a barrel to $12. This shock triggered the greatest transfer of wealth the world had ever seen, as money surged from the industrial economies of the United States and Europe into the treasuries of OPEC nations. Venezuela stood at the center of this transformation. It was a founding member of OPEC, an idea largely conceived by a Venezuelan intellectual named Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. Pérez Alfonso lived modestly and warned that oil was the devil's excrement, a curse that brought waste, corruption, and moral decay. He feared that sudden, unearned wealth would rot the nation from within. But by 1974, no one listened. Cash registers rang loudly, and optimism drowned out caution. Venezuela's new president, Carlos Andrés Pérez, known as Cap, embodied this confidence with speed, charm, and flamboyant style. As petrodollars flooded the country, the treasury overflowed and dollars filled government corridors. Cap promised to build a grand Venezuela, nationalize oil, and forge a first-world nation from unprecedented wealth. He dreamed on a vast scale. He wanted to build the largest hydroelectric dam on Earth and offer scholarships to every student who wished to study overseas. He imagined Venezuela as a modern industrial power leading Latin America into the 21st century. For a brief moment, the vision appeared to work. The government launched the Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho Scholarship Program, a bold experiment in national transformation. Tens of thousands of young Venezuelans were sent abroad at no cost, studying at elite universities in the United States and Europe. They were the children of mechanics and maids, walking the halls of Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. It was an idealistic investment in human capital, meant to secure the country's future. But beneath the optimism, the economic foundations were quietly eroding. This is where the phenomenon known as Dutch disease took hold. As oil dollars flooded in, the Venezuelan currency grew extremely strong, fixed to the dollar at 4.30 and treated as unbreakable. A powerful bolívar made imports cheap and domestic production expensive. Farming and manufacturing no longer made sense when foreign goods cost less than local labor. Agriculture collapsed. Fields were abandoned and farmers moved into cities, settling in shanty towns and relying on government aid. Venezuela stopped producing and began importing everything. This was the first stage of the trap, dependence on imports. The second stage was more dangerous still, debt. It raised a troubling question. Why would a nation drowning in cash need to borrow at all? The answer lay abroad. Oil money from Venezuela and other producers was deposited in major Western banks, creating vast pools of capital that needed borrowers, setting the stage for the next phase of the crisis. As oil money piled up, the United States economy was sliding into recession. American companies stopped expanding and avoided new loans, leaving banks desperate to find borrowers elsewhere. The bankers looked south to Latin America, and especially to Venezuela. They saw a stable democracy with the largest oil reserves in the Western Hemisphere, a borrower that appeared perfectly safe. Executives in tailored suits flew from New York to Caracas aboard the Concorde. They stayed at the Tamanaco Hotel, drank scotch, and met with ministers, their briefcases filled with loan contracts. They did not wait to be asked. They pushed money aggressively, selling a dream in which oil prices would rise forever and inflation would erase the debt. Borrowing, they said, was essentially free money. Under Carlos Andrés Pérez, the government accepted this vision without hesitation. Borrowing accelerated wildly, funding massive infrastructure projects already far over budget. Loans also subsidized imports, keeping whiskey, televisions, and foreign luxuries cheap, while additional borrowing quietly covered corruption draining the treasury. The corruption was enormous. Contracts flowed to political allies, phantom companies absorbed loans never repaid, and cuts were taken from oil, steel, and every major transaction. This gave rise to the 12 Apostles, a small circle of businessmen who became billionaires through proximity to power, building palaces in Caracas and buying private islands across the Caribbean. Hidden deep in the loan contracts was the real danger. The debt carried floating interest rates tied to the United States and London. While celebrations continued, few noticed that when rates rose abroad, Venezuela's burden would rise with them. Deep in the jungle, the government built the vast industrial complex of Ciudad Guayana. In 1976, it nationalized the oil industry, creating PDVSA, and raised the Venezuelan flag over the oil fields in a declaration of economic independence. But the independence was largely symbolic. By the end of the 1970s, Venezuela carried the highest per capita debt in the world, owing billions to the same banks holding its oil revenues. The nation was recycling its own money, paying interest simply to access its wealth. It was a global shell game, and the social consequences soon followed. Traditions of discipline, hard work, and frugality faded. In their place emerged a culture of effortless wealth, where employment was sought not in the private sector but within the state. The bureaucracy ballooned to absurd levels. There were operators for automatic elevators, gardeners without gardens, and consultants who consulted no one. The state became the father, the mother, and the employer of the nation. Beneath the illusion of prosperity, inequality deepened. While the middle class flew to Miami, the poor in the hillside ranchos watched the skyline rise without sharing in the rewards. Subsidies kept gasoline cheaper than water and bread artificially low, but schools decayed and hospitals collapsed. Money flowed into concrete and imports, not into people. As the decade closed, warning signs flashed everywhere. New oil fields in Alaska and the North Sea weakened OPEC's power. Demand slowed and prices began to wobble. In 1979, President Luis Herrera Campins took office and declared he had inherited a mortgaged country. He saw that spending could not continue, but the machinery of subsidies and the dom-dos mentality was already unstoppable. Wealth had come to feel like a natural state. Instead of tightening their belts, the government chose to go further, borrowing even more money just to pay the interest on existing loans. It became a game of musical chairs, with everyone praying the music would never stop. But the music was already slowing. In Washington, a new figure took command. Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, carrying a single, uncompromising mission. Volcker was determined to crush inflation in the United States. To do it, he prepared to raise interest rates to levels never seen before, a decision that would shatter the Venezuelan dream. As 1979 came to a close, Venezuela stood on the edge. Caracas, however, showed no sign of fear. Nightclubs were full. Highways were jammed with American cars. The government spent as if tomorrow did not exist, while New York banks recorded record profits. Yet the trap was already set. Floating interest rates ticked like a time bomb. Oil prices began to weaken. The nation that believed itself richer than the United States was, in truth, a debtor living on borrowed time. In the next chapter, the collapse arrived. The money ran out. Black Friday exposed the illusion, and the Saudi era was revealed as nothing more than a glittering mirage. The year was 1981, and the trap slammed shut. In the United States, Paul Volcker acted. To stop runaway inflation, he raised interest rates to 20%. A brutal form of economic shock therapy that shook the global system. For Venezuela, it was catastrophic. Floating interest rates turned manageable loans into impossible burdens. Debt payments doubled, then tripled, just as oil prices collapsed under global oversupply. The government tried to defend the illusion, burning reserves to hold the bolívar at 4.30. But mathematics prevailed. Dollars fled the country daily, flowing into foreign banks as Saudi Venezuela quietly died. Capital flight erupted on an industrial scale. Those who had benefited most from the boom, the so-called apostles of development, were the first to escape, carrying their billions out of the country. Then came the day of reckoning. Friday, February 18, 1983. A date burned into the memory of every Venezuelan. That morning became known as Viernes Negro, Black Friday. The government surrendered and announced it could no longer defend the currency. The bolívar was devalued, and the sacred exchange rate of 4.30 vanished overnight. A complex system of multiple exchange rates replaced it, but the truth was brutal. The currency had collapsed. Life savings were cut in half. Dollar debts multiplied. Students abroad were stranded as payments stopped and credit vanished. The psychological shock was immense. The era of Dame Dos ended instantly. Concorde flights were canceled, Miami shopping trips ceased, and the middle class suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. The celebration ended, and the lights came on, revealing broken glass and unpaid bills. The hangover had begun, but the financial collapse was only the beginning. The 1980s became the lost decade. Venezuela entered a long descent into poverty. The state was bankrupt, and international banks refused further lending, knowing repayment was impossible. The banks themselves became the adversary. The same institutions that had pushed loans in the 70s now demanded repayment with cold precision, sending lawyers and accountants and demanding cuts to social spending and subsidies. Each renegotiation brought harsher conditions. Infrastructure decayed, hospitals ran out of medicine, roads crumbled, and schools fell apart, as the promises of the Saudi era dissolved completely. By the late 1980s, the dream of a great Venezuela was collapsing in full view of the population. The crisis deepened, and hope became scarce. In 1988, Carlos Andrés Pérez, the man most associated with the boom years, ran for president once again. His campaign was built on nostalgia, promising a return to prosperity and abundance. Desperate for hope, The population believed him. He won in a landslide, as many assumed his presence alone could bring back oil wealth and easy dollars. But when Perez took office in 1989, reality struck. The treasury was empty, reserves were nearly gone, and there was no money left to spend. With no alternatives, he turned to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF offered a $4.5 billion rescue, but only in exchange for a harsh structural adjustment program known as El Gran Virage. The plan demanded privatization, the removal of price controls, and the elimination of gasoline subsidies. For Venezuelans, cheap fuel was sacred, the last visible benefit of an oil-rich nation. Cornered by debt, Perez accepted the terms. On February 27, 1989, fuel prices rose, transportation costs surged, and workers discovered they could no longer afford to reach their jobs. Protests erupted in Guarenas and spread rapidly to Caracas. What began as anger turned into uncontrolled rage as people poured down from the ranchos into the city. For 3 days, Caracas burned. The Caracazo was not a protest but a social explosion, as a society promised paradise erupted in fury after being delivered to purgatory. The police quickly lost control. Carlos Andrés Pérez suspended constitutional protections, sent the army into the streets, and authorized live fire. Soldiers with automatic rifles fired into crowds in shantytowns without distinction. The official death toll stood at roughly 300, but human rights groups believed the real number reached into the thousands. Bodies were buried in mass graves, and the trauma cut deep into the national memory. The Caracazo shattered the bond between the people and the democratic system. It destroyed faith in traditional political parties and erased the belief that Venezuela was somehow immune to the fate of its neighbors. The fantasy of the 1970s had led directly to the bloodshed of the 1980s. The apparent wealth was a trap. Built on borrowing from the future and mortgaging national stability, the United States banking system profited twice. It earned vast fees during the boom and was protected during the collapse by IMF programs that shifted the burden onto ordinary Venezuelans through austerity. The psychological wound was immense. Resentment toward the United States and toward capitalism itself spread rapidly. Many believed their wealth had been stolen by foreign bankers and corrupt domestic elites. Across the country, abandoned construction projects rusted in the sun, standing as monuments to broken promises and plunder. Politicians were no longer trusted. Deception seemed universal. In this landscape of anger and collapse, a young army officer named Hugo Chavez saw his opportunity. In 1992, 3 years after the Caracazo, he attempted a coup. Militarily, Chavez failed. Politically, he succeeded. He spoke of betrayal, stolen oil wealth, and a rotten system, channeling nostalgia for lost prosperity and fury over the broken promise of the Saudi era. Venezuela possessed money, but it lacked the institutions needed to manage it wisely. It fell victim to the resource curse in its most extreme form. Oil made the state independent from its own society. Because the government did not depend on taxes from citizens, it felt little need to listen to them. Its attention was fixed instead on international oil markets and global bankers. When oil prices shifted and the bankers changed their tone, the system unraveled. The tragedy of the Damdos generation was that they believed they were building a modern nation, while, in truth, they were spending their inheritance. The endless celebration ended with a hangover that has now lasted 4 decades. What felt like prosperity was only borrowed time. Even today, Caracas bears the physical remains of that era. Futuristic architecture from the 1970s still stands, cracked, stained, and slowly decaying. Half-finished buildings rise like tombstones, frozen in time. In the memories of the older generation, there remains the image of the Concorde landing at Maiquetía and a Bolívar once admired across the world. But the memory is painful. They now understand that the wealth was an illusion, a loan taken against the future of their children. That debt is still being paid through poverty, mass migration, and the slow destruction of a country that once dreamed of becoming a great Venezuela. The banks recovered their money. The politicians took their rewards. The people were left with the bill. Saudi Venezuela became the story of Icarus, rising on wings of oil and borrowed dollars, only to fall.